Hiya, Weirdos. It's Thursday again. My name is Sarah, and I am joined, as always, by my lovely co-hosts.
I'm Mackenzie.
I'm Chris.
And this podcast is for Weirdos. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Chicago. Chicago.
Oh.
So, have you heard of this place? Do you know anything about it? Talk to me.
Maybe.
I have seen the Ghost Adventures episode at one point in my life.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly about the correct location, I think it's the one where it's like the most famous for a little girl like sitting on a headstone.
It's not a little girl, but yes.
Or like a lady sitting on a headstone.
We will have a picture of that picture.
So, but I know that's also like controversial evidence.
It is.
Is it the one with that really pretty, like, almost like Greek columns?
No. It's
Okay.
like
Different
the middle of the woods.
This is like middle of nowhere.
Got it.
But also in Chicago.
Other than that, I don't know much of
Maybe?
I don't remember much of the history of it or anything
Okay.
like that. I
Yeah.
only remember like that picture like stands out in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us.
Okay, as if we rehearsed it. So I've kind of broken the history up into a couple of different sections.
Ooh.
I'm going to say right off the bat, most of the information on this topic came from Bachelor's. I tell you, I made a weird noise. BachelorsGrove.com, which is a labor of love. It is a beautiful website. It has everything you could possibly want on there. There are pictures. There are historical records. There are maps. There are all kinds of stuff on this website.
That's so cool.
And it is maintained by a man whose name is Pete. I do not know how to say his last name.
Spell it.
Well, it could be Crapia or Crapia. It's Crapia.
Crapia?
Crapia?
I don't know.
Pete. We're going to call him Pete.
Pete.
He kind of maintains that website. When you first open the website, it's like, this website came into being at this time, and at this point, we turned it, basically, it's all Google Docs. So, like, every link that you click on just opens a Google document with everything. It tells you when it was last updated. It's so good. And, like, all the photos are Google photo albums. And there's stuff from a long time ago on there. And there's stuff from as recently as somebody sent it to him. Like,
Cool.
he's still actively updating the website.
I love that.
So, all of the history stuff that I have came from the history article on that website.
Okay.
I just kind of reorganized it into a couple of different sections because the history of this place is kind of weird.
Yeah.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is the name of the place, Bachelor's Grove.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of different variations of the spelling have kind of been around
Okay.
because it's been in some form since the 1820s, 1830s.
Oh, wow.
The variations include bachelor spelt like a person who's a bachelor, bachelder, so
With a D?
like Bachelder, Batchelder, Bachelder without the D, or without the T, so Batch BAC elder, Burzel,
What?
Petzel, right? I don't know. They are variations of the name, not necessarily spellings, but variations of the name. Bachelor BACHLOR, Bachelor BACHELLOR, and Batchel BATCHEL. All of those names have been associated with this area
Of Chicago.
at some point.
Okay.
It is strongly suspected that the original derivation of the name was from the Batchelder family who resided in the area as early as 1845. So that's the BATCHELDER.
Got it.
Most of the area, so this is a really wooded area. If you go there now, it's in a forest preserve.
Okay.
Like
And
in
there's
like a
this
clearing.
big chunk of forest across the street is still forest. It's in a bunch of woods. So most of the stands of timber in the area were named by the families who settled near them.
Okay.
Because this was like a timber
Farm.
area.
Yeah.
Like you were going there to do logging and timber stuff.
Yeah.
So included in that list, Walker's Grove, Gooding's Grove, Cooper's Grove, Blackstone Grove. These were named after the families. So
Got
this
it.
being Bachelor's Grove makes sense for it to be named after the Batchelder family.
Yeah.
Members of that family were known to have been living in Rich Township by 1845, which is like right around in this area. So it's extremely likely that this like grove of trees got its name from that family.
Yeah.
According to the claims of Stephen H. Rexford, who settled, quote, the grove, he settled there, either in 1833 or 1834. He claims that the settlement was named for a group of 4 single men who settled there, including himself, thus Bachelor's Grove.
Okay. So maybe like a wombo combo.
A lot of people think it might be a combination of those things. Ferdinand Schaper, who wrote a manuscript about like this area in 1917, provides a similar notation citing about 1834 or 1833 several bachelors. Among them was Stephen H. Rexford, Eli B. Williams, and possibly one or more of the Bartons, settled there to perfect their titles for government land. As they were all single men and kept bachelors' halls, the place name became known as Bachelor's Grove. It is about 4 miles southwest of Blue Island, so that tells you like where it is, and that is where this place was. Schaper includes the name of about 60 individuals who he noted as settling in or near Bachelor's Grove between 1833 and 1850. So it's just a document about like where people were living in this area. However, as previously noted, the Bachelor's Grove name was apparently already established before this guy got there. He did, however, establish the first post office in the vicinity as Bachelor's Grove with the T, not Bachelder's Grove, but Bachelor's Grove with a T in 1843. And then in 1851, there's a map of Cook and DuPage counties also identified this area as Bachelor's Grove. So that's like, and that's Bachelor without the T.
Okay.
So the area has been called Bachelor's Grove in some way or another
Since the 1840s.
since the 1830s, 1840s era. If you're of a mind to learn a lot about post offices, there's a whole section on the history in the website about the different post offices that have been established in this area. Like it has when the Bachelor's Grove post office was closed, when the next post office was opened, and it's just basically like this little area because it wasn't like a city, right? It's south of Chicago.
Yeah.
It's like a township almost.
Yeah, it is now part of Chicago, but back then it was like 20 miles away from Chicago. So it was like, oh, now it's this little name. And then it's like, well, that settlement's kind of like dissolved. So we're going to move the post office a mile this way. And it's part of this township now. So it's had a bunch of different names. I'm not going into that. If you want to learn about it, though, it's on the website and it's great.
Pete does a good job.
He does a great job. Whoever did that bit of research
Pete is super
did a
into
great job. The post office info is great. So now we're going to talk about who was living here, who was settled in this area.
Yeah.
So the settlement at Bachelor's Grove began as early as the 1820s, is when we have record of people starting to move to this area, with larger number of immigrants arriving in the 1830s and 40s. So they started trickling in the 1820s, and then it became like a bigger bit of a settlement about 10, 20 years later.
Okay.
The initial settlers were Americans of English, Irish, and Scottish descent, most of whom came here from New York, Vermont, Connecticut, like they were just moving west. The second wave of settlers were arriving from Europe. They were primarily German in origin. And that began in the late 1840s and became the predominant nationality for immigrants in the area for like the next 50 years.
Fascinating.
So like the first 20-ish years were people just moving west.
Yeah.
Moving out of big cities, moving kind of into the woods. And then the second wave was a bunch of Germans.
Yeah.
Just popping up into the area. Mackenzie, fun fact, at the Methodist Conference held in Jacksonville, Illinois in 1832, Stephen R. Beggs of Walker's Grove was assigned the charge of Des Plaines Mission, which included Bachelor's Grove, located 20 miles south of Chicago. This clearly indicated that some significant settlement was happening in that vicinity prior to 1832, enough for them to have like, hey, you are in charge of this area.
Go church it.
Go be church.
Correct. Gazetteer.
I like that name.
Gazetteer? Gazette? It's a gazette ear.
Gazetteer,
whatever, of Illinois, by J.M. Peck, contains the following listing.
Okay.
Bachelor's Grove, again, we've got the D in there now.
With
And
the TCH.
Not with the T, just with the D.
Okay.
Don't worry, after this, it's just Bachelor, like
Thank
like a
goodness.
guy.
Okay.
Because Chris and I are over here really
I know,
like,
there's a lot of letters.
There's a lot of like math happening.
Don't worry
it's
about it.
like the guy at the chalkboard with all the numbers.
Yeah, you're
around
right.
is like, huh.
Bachelor's Grove in Cook County, 18 miles southwest of Chicago, contains about 2 sections of timber and a large settlement.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Most of the early settlement in this area occurred near timberlands, which supplied materials for construction and where
Yeah.
try again. Where grassland prairies were easier to break and cultivate. So, like, you've got your timberlands, and then next to the woods, you've got really nice fertile soil that's easy to cultivate for farmland.
Yeah.
Till it up.
Now we're going to talk about the cemetery.
Okay.
This is a lot.
Where people live, people die.
Correct. So, although you cannot be buried there now, it's done. It's closed.
It's done. It's closed.
Bachelor's,
No more room.
No more room.
Maybe we should go.
What?
Nothing. Go ahead.
Okay. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery is one of the oldest cemeteries in South Cook County. Its legal location description is, quote, 1 acre in the east half of the northwest quarter of Section 8, Township 36 North, Range 13, east of the 3rd Principal Meridian, parentheses, Bremen Township, Cook County, Illinois.
Jiminy Christmas.
More simply, it is across from what is now called the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve on 143rd Street, just east of Ridgeland Avenue. You can find it on a map.
Great.
You can also just Google it. It's down a trail, so the road to get to the cemetery was originally a section of the Midlothian Turnpike that has been closed to vehicle traffic since the 1960s.
Huh.
So now it's just like a path that's been kind of overgrown.
Like a hiking trail.
Yeah. According to that 1917 manuscript by Ferdinand Schaeper, Southern Cook County and History of Blue Island before the Civil War, the first burial in this cemetery at Bachelor's Grove, which was then called Everden's Cemetery at Bachelor's Grove, was that of Eliza Scott in November of 1844. However, the
How did she
earliest...
die?
What?
Do you know how she died?
No. There's not a lot of information about these people, unfortunately. Okay. However, the earliest death date noted in the newspaper article, Pioneers in Peaceful Rest, Bachelor's Grove, one of first cemeteries, lies serene, undisturbed. That's the whole headline for this article title.
Wow.
Which appeared in the Blue Island Sun-Standard, which was published in 1935. They say that the first buried there was William B. Nobles, who died in 1838, so about 6 years earlier than this Eliza person. The last burials to take place in the cemetery are believed to be that of Laura M. McGee in 1965 and Robert E. Shields in 1989, who was cremated, and his cremains were buried on his family's plot in the cemetery. So before they closed the turnpike, that was the road that basically led to the cemetery.
Yeah.
It was becoming a hangout for the youth.
The youth. How dare
The youth are hanging out at the cemetery?
The youth are hanging out on the road to the cemetery.
Oh, on the
basically.
road. Okay.
Yeah. And also at the cemetery.
Okay. 'Cause I was like,
It became popular as a lover's lane and for people to go, drink.
I want to go make out with the dead people.
Right. Once...
okay, but who doesn't?
Who doesn't?
It's pretty.
Then once they closed the road, it became even worse. It was like, oh, cars can't go down this road anymore,
No cops.
but we can? Hell yeah. So, unfortunately, once they closed the road, vandalism in the cemetery got really bad.
Womp womp.
There's been evidence of, quote, satanic rituals in the 1970s, and also grave openings and grave robbings from time to time,
Oh.
particularly in the 60s and 70s.
Wild.
Desecration and vandalism reached its peak in the 1970s, with many of the stones being broken, defaced, spray painted, and even stolen. It is
Don't do that.
Do
if you're
not-
gonna go visit a cemetery.
sad.
Don't do that.
Shit like that. That's rude.
Yeah, it's actually really sad. There's only 20 stones left, and this
Oh.
cemetery is full.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a big bummer. It's believed that many of the missing stones ended up at the bottom of the nearby quarry pond. In a newspaper article, Clarence Fulton indicated that grave markers were found in Maywood, which is the sheriff's police headquarters, Evergreen Park, and even Chicago police headquarters. Whatever happened to these recovered, air quotes, markers is unknown. Fulton noted that during these turbulent years, if they had returned the markers to the cemetery, they would have just gotten stolen again.
Yeah, they would have just disappeared again.
So they were like, we're not going to return them, but then they never returned them. So, and it's not really clear where they ended up
Yeah.
in the later time. According to Fulton's reminiscing, Bachelor's Grove Cemetery was kind of like a park. You could go fishing or swim in the adjacent pond. He noted that it was really pretty, and families would go there on Sundays to have a picnic while visiting their loved ones who were buried there.
Yeah.
And the cemetery still presents a peaceful park-like setting, and you can often find individuals fishing in the quarry pond. However, people do not swim there anymore. It's spooky. and the water is gross.
Yeah, I was like, quarry ponds are not safe to swim in.
Right. People also
Pro
don't
tip,
really
don't do that.
Yeah. People also don't picnic there as much anymore today.
People don't picnic as much anymore.
Right. People don't really go on family picnics.
Yeah.
They hang out
Especially
at home.
not with like to their loved ones.
Right. They're not going to
Their-
go to
their
the
dead loved
cemetery to
ones.
picnic with their loved ones. That's kind of a thing of a bygone era.
I did see some people doing that the other day, though.
I've seen it, but it's less common.
It's way less common than it used
You
to
should.
be.
Everyone should do that. If you have a loved one that's buried, go spend some time with them.
Yeah,
clean
go
up
have
their
a picnic.
clean up their plot. Have a picnic.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing with the cemetery history, periodically families with ancestors, family members buried in the grove had their bodies moved to other cemeteries that were either more prestigious, closer to where they lived, or had more room for future family members to be buried with them. The isolated location and the vandalism in more recent years compelled a lot of families to move
their
relatives to
loved ones.
other cemeteries. The first known relocations happened in the 1880s. So
wow.
it was not like they didn't start because of the vandalism. They started because people were like, we moved. We don't live in this area anymore. We would like
Yeah.
to have our great grandpa with us when we all die. So that way we
Uh-huh.
can all be together. Some families, such as the descendants of John Fulton Jr., have erected new memorial markers at the cemetery where the rest of the family members are buried, but left
The body.
the remains and whatever marker was left at Bachelor's Grove.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't move them. They just put up a memorial marker for them
Yeah.
elsewhere, which is not uncommon. The cemetery is now under the supervision and responsibility of the cemetery trustees
Oh.
of the Cook County Board. The county board was approached by an aging Clarence Fulton. So the Fulton family is who kind of owned the property.
Mm-hmm.
So he was like, I am old in 1975, and he approached this board to take over the maintenance of the cemetery.
Yeah.
He had previously requested Bremen Township's assistance in caring for the cemetery in 1967, but they turned him down.
Rude.
Right. He indicated that there was a Bachelor's Grove Cemetery Association, but no official record appears to exist for a cemetery association.
I see.
Maybe it was just him.
Right. I am the cemetery association. In researching the history of the legal title to the cemetery at that time, it was determined that the title probably still rested in the hands of the descendants of Edward M. Everden. So the original guy who owned the property was Everden, and then his family sold it to the Fulton family.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the title of the cemetery property didn't ever actually change hands.
Got it.
Apparently. Since no deed could be found for the cemetery itself, and subsequent deeds and property transfers specifically excluded the acre of the cemetery. So it's like, we don't know where this deed for this property actually is.
Yeah.
After clarifying the legal description and boundaries for the cemetery and obtaining clear title through condemnation procedures, Cook County assumed responsibility for the cemetery in about 1976.
Okay.
So they basically went through the process of having the area condemned,
Yeah.
so that way they could take ownership of it.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, that's fair. We don't have a deed.
Yeah. It's like, well, yeah, deed gone. Deed
Right.
never existed, maybe?
Yeah. Through a bunch of intergovernmental agreements, the maintenance on the cemetery is shared by the Cook County Forest Preserve District and the board. So a couple of the board of Cook County and this Forest Preserve District.
A couple of different hands in that.
Yeah. According to an unsubstantiated account, the Chicago Archdiocese of the Catholic Church also has provided some maintenance for the cemetery from time to time, but there's no
There's no
record
legal
of that,
agreement.
so
Yeah.
we don't actually know if that's true or not.
It would surprise me.
It wouldn't surprise me either, but there's just no record of that actually happening.
Yeah.
Let's talk about ghosts.
Tell me about ghosts.
Ready to hear about some ghosts?
I'm so ready.
Okay, so the first, again, the way that I have this formatted, I had the history kind of broken up into a couple of sections. On the the website for the cemetery, they have a tab that is paranormal. You click that tab, there's a list of Google documents about different specific paranormal phenomena that happen in the cemetery.
Cool.
So I have a little bit about each of those, and then I have some personal accounts.
We love
from
a
some
first-hand
people.
account.
So some of these are it's a 3-page Google document. I've just kind of summarized what the phenomena is.
Okay.
So the first thing we have is the blue light.
Ooh.
Ooh. A lot of these kind of originate in the same kind of time
Uh-huh.
from the same kind of group of people.
Okay.
So if you're in the 1980s, it's because that was when people were doing the research on this.
Yeah.
The origin of the blue light stories come from the 1970s, and a man named Jack Hermansky.
Hermansky. What a name.
Okay.
He described seeing a blue light floating in the cemetery that grew to the size of a basketball and blinked in 10 to 20 second intervals and rapidly changed positions. He had seen the light on at least 2 different occasions when visiting Bachelor's Grove. The light has been sighted outside of the cemetery on the path leading to it, as well as on the road that still exists nearby. So that actual road in Chicago, 143rd, they've like seen this light on the road as well. The one commonality in the sightings of this light is that it has apparent intelligence.
Interesting.
So there are a few instances of people being chased or followed by the light, but the one sign most people point to it being intelligent is that it will fade from view when approached, only to reappear right behind the person who was trying to get to it.
Oh.
So like if you're walking towards this light, it will go like and appear right behind you.
Hate that.
I don't like
Right.
that.
To me, that feels very kind of UFO, like less
Yeah.
super paranormal. Because like most ghost lights, it's like you see a light, and then the light fades, and then that's the end of the light.
I
And then
mean,
it's gone.
unless it's kind of a combination of an intelligent orb almost.
Right. It's very odd.
It is definitely not explainable. That's a very odd, because it's not your standard orb behavior.
No, it's
which
also
is-
not like it's not car lights. It's not because car lights don't disappear when you walk towards them and then appear behind you. Like,
no.
Yeah, no.
That's very
It's very odd.
it's very odd.
Makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't like the blue light.
Like there's nothing I can come up with off the top of my head to like
Right.
debunk that.
I will say people now, if they go to the cemetery at night, often see blue lights, and it is because you are not allowed to be in the cemetery after dark, and those blue lights are the flashlights of the police who are coming to get you. Do not be there after sunset. It is against the law, not just against the rules of the cemetery. It is illegal to be there after dark.
Darn.
You can go, but once the sun starts to set, you need to get out of there.
gotta
It's sun
skedaddle.
up to sunset. Because of all the vandalism that happened, they've shut it down. You can't be there after dark, which is why it's actually really interesting that Ghost Adventures was allowed to film there, because they don't even let official real paranormal investigators there after dark anymore.
Again, I think it was
when you
real
have
early.
money.
It was a long time
It was
ago.
a-
Yeah,
it
it
was
was
in the-
before they had a ton of money, which is why I'm like,
Yeah.
it's kind of odd. So then we have the red light, similar
Okay.
to the blue light, but red. Earliest known reports of the red light phenomena start from this guy, Norman Basile, who did an overnight trip in the cemetery in the 80s. He described red streaks of light flashing and darting around the cemetery,
Oh.
like streaks specifically.
Weird.
Others have reported red lights that look like flares or beacons, but when investigated, they aren't coming from anywhere. Like, they don't ever find a flare. They don't see smoke. Like, they don't
Yeah.
see anything that makes sense for this to be a flare. Still, others describe the red light as a fiery ball of light that kind of drifts around the cemetery in the wind after dark. Often, after seeing the lights, people will turn to point them out to others, only to find that the light has vanished when they turn back to point it out.
Weird.
So, like, if I was like, oh my God, a light, and I was like, guys, look at this light, and then I looked back, it would be gone. So there's just lots of odd light phenomena in this cemetery. For who
Which
knows why.
again feels more UFO, because
Right.
UFOs are associated with a lot more
light phenomena.
light phenomena than your standard ghost haunting
Right.
is.
Right.
Especially being
Weird.
in a forested setting, like you can't do your standard debunk of like car lights or
Right. It is in the woods.
like it's very, very, very in the woods. So it's just interesting that you're getting so much more light phenomena than like a shadow person in the woods or
Right.
like. So maybe it could be interesting if it has to do more with the woods themselves and less
Than
to
the
do
actual-
with the cemetery.
It also feels kind of fey to me.
yeah. I was like, it's
Like,
either
especially the blue light disappearing in front of you and then reappearing behind you. Like,
I'm
that's very
wondering-
fucking with you kind of
it would
vibes
be
Yeah.
interesting to go
during the day.
there, yes, during the day, but just to see what the woods themselves
What it feels
are
like.
Like, what do the
Yeah.
woods feel like? Because if you're talking about a quarry pond and, you know, it's a very people are saying it's a very, calming, peaceful kind of park-esque environment, feels real easy to go fae, or to have fairy activity.
What kind of quarry was it?
A rock quarry.
What kind of rock?
It doesn't tell me anywhere. Just said it was a stone quarry.
Okay.
So the next thing that we have kind of ties into the story of the initial sighting of the red lights. It's that same overnight investigation that Norman Basile took. He and an associate were specifically in the cemetery looking for paranormal phenomena. Like they were doing a ghost hunt.
Yeah.
His associate, who is not named in anything that I could find, was a self-proclaimed skeptic and came along to help carry camera and recording equipment. He was like, I'm not here to see ghosts.
I'm here to carry shit.
I'm here to carry stuff for Norman.
I'm here to camp in the woods.
I'm here to go camping in the woods with my friend. By midnight, the associate was feeling real bad for Norman because they had not seen anything.
Aww.
He was like, womp womp, we haven't seen anything. The associate then spotted the figure of a man in his 40s, dressed all in yellow, wearing a suit and a hat.
Curious George.
He turned to point it out to Norman, who just missed seeing it before it vanished. When discussing what it was, they began seeing red streaks of light darting around the cemetery, and a large tree started to violently shake on the windless night. Since that first reported instance, there have been several other people who have reported seeing, quote, the yellow man, including Pete, the man who runs the website, who believes he saw him in 1998.
That's my year.
It is your year.
That feels very fey.
Right,
Like,
it's the guy just being like, boop, bye.
bye, and then like a tree just shaking. That's
With no
odd.
wind. And they specifically were like, it was a big tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Weird.
said yellow suit, yellow hat, and I went, Curious George?
Yeah.
That's the man who was in my head.
Right. So the next thing is called the caretaker.
Ugh.
Ooh. So people report seeing an old man with a yellow lantern who is seemingly guarding the cemetery. Some have been chased out of the cemetery after dark by him wielding a shotgun and a lantern. Rumors and stories have kind of compounded and merged, often having this story blend with another, saying that the Phantom Farmhouse, which we'll talk about next, was the caretaker's, or that he is the Hookman.
Hookman
The one with
Carhandor.
the-
We
Car-
will be talking about Hookman in this episode. Very briefly. Content warning, murder and suicide. Lots of people there's, of course, a legend that teenagers started that say he killed his whole family and then killed himself and burned their house down with all of the bodies inside. This rumor obviously cannot be substantiated. Very briefly, the next section is, of course, titled Mandor Handhook Cargun. It was a popular place for teens to hang out. Of course, the
lover's lane.
Hookman legend found its way to this place. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because we are probably going to do an urban legends episode, and I didn't want to get into it in this. It's too much of a tangent to go down. But as early as the 40s, teens were telling each other stories of how they barely escaped the Hookman when they went parking out at the old cemetery.
No, they probably barely escaped the cops.
Probably.
Right.
Hookman.
Hookman, the cops. Now we're going to talk about the Phantom Farmhouse, which is really cool. This is one of the most well-known stories for this place because it's kind of the least repeated. Like, kind of everything else that... repeated in that it doesn't happen elsewhere. Like, everything else, like ghost lights, caretaker who chases you out of a cemetery, Hookman. Like, those are all things... The Yellow Man's kind of odd, but, like... This is a
very unique to this
story.
location.
So, legend tells of a small single-story Victorian house being visible from the cemetery. So it's not inside the cemetery, but when you're in the cemetery, you can look and see this house in the woods. There are a few different variations to the story. Some people report seeing the house clear as day, colorful and welcoming, with warm firelight visible in the windows. But on their return to the cemetery, they find there is no longer a house visible nor any spot where a house could have been.
Ooh.
Others will have seen the house very clearly like it's a real house, tell someone about their trip to the cemetery, wondering about who could live there, only to be told there is no house on the property. And likely there never was. The other version... So that's kind of one version, right? It's like you see a house that's obviously a house, and then the next time you come back or when you tell somebody about it, they're like, there's not a house there. The other version is people report seeing the house and it shrinking as they approach until it completely vanishes from view,
This feels like a Fey ring.
or watching the house slowly fade away until nothing remains and there is no evidence of a house being there at all. So, like, looking at a house and then it disappears like an apparition.
That's weird.
The last legend is that if you manage to get to the door and enter the house, you will never be able to leave, which is also very Fey.
That's some fairy shit.
Right. And it's like, it's Victorian, which is like the era when this place was settled. Like, it's very odd. And it's like, oh, it's warm, it's welcoming. Like, there's like firelight in the windows.
Yeah.
It's a bright, colorful Victorian house. It doesn't look run down. It looks lived in and new. So, very spooky, very unique. Like, that's not a story I've heard anywhere else. Like, I've
No.
heard stories of like, oh, you see a house and then the next time you come back, it's like, oh yeah, that house burned down 50 years ago, right? Like, that's a story that exists. But the fact that there's no evidence that a house existed there at all,
Ever? Yeah.
and that there's like no clearing in the trees for there to be a house is very odd, very peculiar. We've got 3 more of the like specific stories before we get into like personal stories.
Okay.
So we have the farmer and horse.
Oh.
In 1982, a story began to circulate about the ghost of a farmer and his horse that would appear either walking out of the pond and across the road, or appear in the middle of the road, walking away from the pond and disappearing into the woods on the opposite side of the road. The legend that was tied to this apparition was that in the 1870s, a farmer was plowing his field across the road from the cemetery and the pond when his horse got startled, dragging the horse, the farmer, and the plow into the pond where they drowned. However, the pond adjacent to the cemetery is a quarry pond and was not there until after 1900 when they started digging the rock quarry. Regardless of the origin of the legend being rather shaky, people do report seeing a farmer, his horse, and a plow on the street, as well as seeing their heads bobbing above the water in the pond.
Oh.
Not like disembodied, but like
Yeah.
there's somebody struggling in the pond.
Huh.
It's, again, if it is a true story, if there was a pond that we just don't have record of, if the rock quarry pond was a smaller pond back in the day, regardless of that, enough people have told this story that it appears that haunting is happening.
Yeah.
Intentions.
Intentional hauntings, ooh.
Or unintentional.
Or unintentional.
Unintentional.
Intended.
Hauntings based on intent is what
Yeah.
I mean when I say an intentional haunting. Not that you did it on purpose. It
Right.
means that people's intent has haunted a location.
Yeah.
The telling of that story has created a haunting,
Yeah.
a thought form, an egregore, what have you. Next, we have the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove.
Oh.
This is the one I was talking about?
This is the picture. There's a very famous photograph, which we'll talk about kind of at the end. There's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding about this spirit. She is referenced interchangeably as the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove, the White Lady or the Lady in White, and Mrs. Rogers.
Okay.
Of course there's a lady in white.
The very first reference to this specific apparition is that of what appears to be a nun holding an infant, which occurred in 1979. This is the only time that it is described as appearing nun-like, which to me seems like it might be a separate phenomena, but it is lumped into the Madonna sightings.
Okay.
Most frequently, she is seen wandering the cemetery in a white dress, obviously. And it's about 50-50 whether or not she's carrying a baby. Because of the times when she is not carrying a baby, she has been lumped into the, quote, woman in white phenomena seen around the globe of a woman looking for her baby. We will cover more about this phenomena when we do an Urban Legends episode.
Yep.
The most famous occurrence of the Madonna was in 1991 in an infrared photograph taken by Jude Fells of the Ghost Research Society of Oak Lawn, Illinois, which shows a woman sitting atop a tombstone base staring off into the woods. Jude insists that no one else was in the cemetery and that the woman was not there when the photograph was taken. We will have this picture on social media. It is a very controversial ghost photograph. If you have ever looked up ghost photographs, you've
seen
probably seen this picture. So a lot of times it's cropped to show just the woman, and you're like, well, that's got to be a ghost. How could you like be taking a picture of a tombstone and not see a woman when you're taking this picture? But the actual picture is very, very like big landscape of the cemetery, and the Madonna is like
Small. in the
small
corner.
off to the side.
Interesting.
In follow-up interviews, the Ghost Research Society was talking about what this investigation looked like. Basically, they had people at the gate, and they were sending people in for 20 minutes, one at a time, and then they would send someone to go collect the person and bring them back out. So they were walked out of the cemetery, and then the next person was sent in. So they did their best to prevent any sort of contamination of there being more than one person in the cemetery, but it's also entirely possible that another person was there. And Jude just didn't see the picture when the picture was taken, or see the person when the picture was taken.
Yeah.
It's also entirely possible it's a ghost. Like, if you look at this photograph, I'm going to say something in the second most recent episode of the Haunted Objects podcast. They talk about the cemetery. Greg and Dana Newkirk's The Haunted Objects podcast. They talk about Bachelor's Grove. And they had Carl look at this photograph and try and see if there's any camera trickery to this photograph.
Yeah.
And Carl basically came to the conclusion that's either a person or it isn't. But there's no camera trickery. Like, it's not a double exposure. It's not anything.
Okay.
There is something in this picture, and it's either a person or it isn't.
Yeah.
So it's either a person or it's a ghost.
Yeah.
We will have the picture up on socials because I did find a copy of it on the website that we can use. Lastly, we have the phantom dog of Bachelor's Grove.
A puppy.
A doggo. The story of the ghost dog of Bachelor's Grove go back to the 80s. Troy Taylor, who we talked about in the Waverly Hills episode, he owns Haunted America Inc. or Hauntings Inc., I believe. He told a story that I told on the Waverly Hills episode. He wrote a book called Haunted Illinois. And he mentions people seeing a large spectral black dog at the entrance to the path that leads to the cemetery.
Oh.
It always disappears when approached, usually right in front of the witness. So you'll walk towards it and it'll go gone.
Bye-bye, puppy.
Yeah. There have been reports where in a group of people, only some of them will actually be able to see the dog and others will see nothing. In these instances, the dog usually doesn't move, just stares at the group until it slowly vanishes from sight. A few witnesses report the dog following them on their way out of the cemetery as the sun goes down, only for it to vanish when they reach the end of the path. The dog never barks, growls, makes any sounds at all, and rarely interacts with people other than, making
Watching
eye contact with them. It will look at you and it will follow you with its eyes, but if you approach it, it's going to disappear. It doesn't make any noises, that kind of thing. There's actually a superstition that I'm going to briefly touch on. It was an old, I don't remember what era it's from, superstition, where the first soul buried in a cemetery will be trapped there.
Yeah.
So they would often find a stray dog and kill that dog and then bury it in the cemetery. So that way the dog's soul would be the thing trapped because people believe that dogs have souls correctly. And that's a super common thing. So if you see a dog in a cemetery, it was probably the first thing buried there. So that way no people would be trapped.
No people souls.
In the cemetery. And so usually these dogs are non-threatening. They're just kind of hanging out. They're vibing. They're like a guardian for that cemetery.
Yeah.
It's a guard dog. And they usually often appear as a black dog.
Yeah.
It's the Grim.
It's a Grim. You're going to die. Okay. So now there's a blog that I found called Pray for Ghosts. It's the name of the blog.
Oh.
Sorry, I did not mean to.
No, yeah, you're right. It's a silly name. It's a good name. This story is from that blog. Again, this is copy and pasted from the Pray for Ghosts blog.
Ghosts.
They glow.
They glow.
Don't you know?
You never seen a glowing ghost? So I'm just going to read it like the scary story it is.
Okay.
One night, just before Halloween, during my sophomore year at college, I and several others were gathered in a friend's room in the underclassmen's dormitory. Matt, a chemistry major with a personality and voice reminiscent of comedian Jim Carrey's, was telling ghost stories. The lights in the room were off, and he held a lit Zippo lighter under his face as he told stories of his native Oak Lawn, one of the many villages that make up Chicago's southern suburbs, and of the richly storied surrounding towns. It was on this night that I first heard of Monk's Castle, the limestone church of St. James at Sag Bridge, and its haunted burial ground. The first time I heard of the phantom hearse of Archer Woods, a black carriage driven by a team of mad horses, and it was the first time I heard of Bachelor's Grove. Matt told what I would come to discover is a classic tale of what he and others called the Grove. One night in high school, he and some friends had driven to Bachelor's Grove to hike through the woods to the cemetery, which was a popular place for drinking, making out, and general teenage shenanigans. The night was cold. Fall had come early, and they shuddered as they sat on crumbling tombstones, talking and sharing cans of beer that they'd carried in their coat pockets. After some time, an eerie feeling came over them, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, a flashing blue light appeared through the trees. Expecting that the local police had discovered them in the preserve off limits after sundown, the three friends bolted down the path towards the adjacent creek, as the bridge that once spanned it was long gone. They could easily cross it on foot and find freedom in the woods beyond, and the path to Richland Avenue. But as the young men sprinted across the creek bed, they were stunned to find that the flashing light had also crossed the creek bed, easily 3 feet below the road, along the path too narrow for a car, and was pursuing them into the forest. This was no police car.
Oh.
This was one of the many mysterious lights that had been reported at the Grove for at least 30 years. So they thought it was a cop car, not a flashlight.
Yeah.
Matt told us other stories of the Grove. The story of the Madonna in white who traversed the woods endlessly in search of her baby. The story of the, quote, magic house that appeared and disappeared along the path to the cemetery. The story of black cars and phantom dogs that silently stalked trespassers on the fabled cemetery grounds. With each word, I fell deeper under the spell that many well know. Like so many have come to find, Bachelor's Grove had me at hello. Truly, I could not get Bachelor's Grove out of my head after that night. But though I had access to millions of books through our college interlibrary loan system, references to this compelling place in this pre-internet world were scarce at best. I found a clipping of a yellowed Chicago Tribune article, which interviewed Chicago's original ghost hunter, the late Richard Crow, who talked about a dream house that would appear and disappear in the woods around the cemetery. I found the wonderful book Psychic City, Chicago, Doorway to Another Dimension by the great Brad Steiger, and the classic Haunted Heartland by Beth Scott and Michael Norman. But that was all. As for going to the source, without a car and before the suburban bus system, Bachelor's Grove might as well have been on the moon. Amazingly, I scrolled too far. Amazingly, the same year, I met the man who introduced me to the science of parapsychology. Jim Horan was a student in psychology at IBC, and the department was allowing him to focus much of his studies on parapsychological research. It was through our friendship that I became a research assistant in parapsychological fieldwork, and that I came to work on my first investigations into the paranormal. Some of these investigations were at Bachelor's Grove. The first investigation was part of a series of experiments focused on the Grove. Are more anomalous photographs actually taken there than at other cemeteries? Are visitors predisposed to have anomalous experiences there because of the site's notoriety? Are the electrical magnetic fields of the site regulated by paranormal factors? I will never forget my first visit to this place, walking the path through the woods to this lost little burial ground. Just inside the gate, which at the time was padlocked, but with a human-sized rip in the chain link down it serving as entry. In front of the stone marking for the Moss family burials, a little plastic doll's hand had been stuck in the dirt, a cigarette held between its fingers, as if some long-dead resident was reaching up for an afternoon smoke. The sight should have chilled me, and I was certainly appalled by the sacrilege, but there was something else, too, that came through. "Hello," this token seemed to say. "We're here. We're hanging out on this beautiful day. Come in and get to know us." It was a gloriously sunny afternoon, and I saw myself what many still describe upon the first visit, an astoundingly magical place. I saw that the play of the light in the cemetery is unusual and could certainly trick the eye and cause rampant simulacra to be created. Everywhere I looked, it seemed there was a face on a tombstone, a pair of eyes in the bark of a tree, a child stepping through the grass. I was overwhelmed by the feeling of peace which many visitors experience. There was no way to reconcile my emotions with the dreadful reputation of this site. This was my first experience of the, quote, moods of Bachelor's Grove that frequent visitors know very well. Like any living, breathing entity, the Grove is sometimes happy and sometimes decidedly not. It sometimes shows itself and wants to play, and sometimes pulls the cover over its head until you leave. Sometimes, too, Bachelor's Grove will make you leave. During those first visits, nothing out of the ordinary happened to back up the extraordinary international fame of this site, though our photography experiments did suggest that more blacked out or whited out photographs did in fact seem to be produced there. The results of those experiments were eventually published in the Journal of Perceptual and Motor Skills, and to my knowledge, this remains some of the only academic research ever published about Bachelor's Grove. At the time of publication, Jim and I had long before graduated and parted ways. He fell into the world of academic clinical psychology, and I into graduate studies in history. But I had not seen the last of Bachelor's Grove. Over the next 30 years, I would come to witness the many moods of this complex, elusive place, from kind to cutthroat. Though 30 years later, I have, realizing its unpredictable power, sworn 100 times to never go back. I expect I will never stop. Variously, it is called the most haunted cemetery in Chicago, the most haunted place in Chicago, and even the most haunted cemetery on Earth. Bachelor's Grove has been both a mecca for ghost hunters and a thorn in the side for the county for generations. For investigators like me, it's become a second home from which we can't long stay away.
Fascinating.
That's really cool.
It was a great story. Okay, now I have a couple of stories from Reddit and then some TripAdvisor reviews. So first, from Reddit user Prize Moment 2875, posted in r/ghosts.
Oh, good.
The title is Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, saw the famous lady in white. It's been a few years since I'd gone, but I remember it. I'm reading this exactly how they wrote it.
As you
Good.
should.
But I remember like it was yesterday. A group of friends decided to go in the middle of the night to Bachelor's Grove. It was around 12:30 when we entered the path, and me and
Stupid.
friend both heard a faint scream coming from deep in the woods. I heard it and instantly stopped dead in my tracks. What?
Fae shit. Screams in the woods.
Yeah, screams in the woods is scary. Stopped
Also
dead
could
in
be
my.
a cougar.
Could be a cougar. Could be a
I'm
mountain
just
lion.
saying, if it's not an animal,
Yeah.
shit's scary.
Yeah.
Um,
Scary regardless.
I stopped dead in my tracks as it was nighttime and I know of police presence. We decided to use the faint light of my phone flashlight to continue in further, despite my gut telling me to turn back.
Listen to your gut,
Right.
people.
We
Listen.
we continued on the path for about 5 minutes until I felt and saw this white shadow or mist rush towards me. All my friends witnessed this. It stopped us in our tracks. There's no punctuation in this.
Oh.
So the breakup
It's
of
Reddit.
sentences is hard. Yeah, it's Reddit. It stopped us in our tracks. This was our first time going, so we was unaware the location of the cemetery was at, but we was freaking out. I realized we were right at the entrance. I now believe this was the ghost in the white dress that we saw. After hanging out and smoking a quick J to ease our nerves, we walked around the cemetery. I decided to do audio recordings of us just hanging out. Nothing really happened as we were inside besides seeing shadows. But when I got home and checked the audio, I caught multiple EVPs. One of them you can hear saying something about touching or having my blood. I decided it's probably for the best I don't return, even though I'm curious and think about returning. If anyone wants to hear the EVPs, I can send them over to you. I didn't ask for the EVPs.
Oh.
It was posted like 5 years ago.
Okay.
It was an old post. Some of these are like archived because they're so old. I guess. So there's that one. Somebody saw a weird white mist, freaked them out,
Uh-huh.
and then they smoked some marijuana, and now they're fine.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
Next we have from Reddit user Jesse Gray 88 posted in r/paranormal experiences (parentheses a couple actually) in Chicago's Bachelor's Grove Cemetery.
Oh.
I was reading various spooky stuff online one of those nights and stumbled in here. Felt like sharing. Not very active on Reddit, more of a browser, but I feel like others may appreciate this. So Bachelor's Grove Cemetery is quite well-known place here in Chicago, specifically south of the city in Midlothian. A very old, rather small cemetery that is seemingly forgotten. Overgrown, gravestones crumbling next to a large swamp. Tons of paranormal sightings here all over the internet, in books, etc. Me and about 8 friends decided to go pay a visit to the cemetery one night close to Halloween when we were all roughly in the 20 to 23 age range. None of us had been there before, so we figured we'd go in the spirit of Halloween, which was still like
Fun.
2.5 weeks away, but whatever. When
Us.
when we arrived in 3 separate cars, we realized the parking lot for the adjacent park grounds were all closed for the night. And of course, there's not a lot for this cemetery. So we went to a local 7-Eleven about 1.5 miles north of the cemetery. The lot there was empty, and the clerk in the store said he was fine with us parking in the back of the lot to head over to the cemetery on foot. So it begins. I like it that they asked.
How
They
polite
went,
of their
"Hey, do you
20
care?
to
Do you care if we park here?"
They probably were like, you're not going to tow our cars, right? If we like park them here,
Yeah.
like
We'll buy
Please-
something.
Please don't tow me.
We'll buy
It's
gas
like-
when we leave.
yeah, it's like we'll get some gas, we'll get a candy bar,
Right.
use the
Slurpee.
bathroom.
Yeah, get a Slurpee at 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
We made the trek south. There were no sidewalks in this area, so we were just walking along the side of the road. Surprisingly, not a single car passed the entire time we were walking. Everything was just quiet. We finally reached the opening to the cemetery, which is just a few yellow posts and a dainty chain draped across with a couple darker posts with a small closed sign on it. And then they included the Google Maps coordinate, but I'm not going to read those. Passing through this, you start down a long, it has a bunch of O's, trail into the woods that is eclipsed by a canopy of trees across its length, blocking most of the already dim streetlights. We got a pretty far distance onto this trail when we came across a branching path that was basically pitch black and had a similar canopy made from trees and bushes, but was only about 5 feet high or so. Everyone was spooked, but I generally love anything creepy and exploring that sort of thing, so I ventured in as my friends made various comments about how much of a nope move that was. This sounds like I wrote this. I didn't. I don't have a Reddit. I went through for maybe a minute or two and cleared the canopy, only to see a wooden porch of a house with a lantern on by the door.
Ooh.
Figuring I may be trespassing on the property of the people who may tend to the cemetery or something, I turned back. Though we were technically trespassing in the cemetery anyway, I figured don't push it. Told my friends it was nothing, and we moved along the actual cemetery. Again, there's not a house there.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool place. Amazing overgrown scenery right next to the swamp. Plenty of old gravestones. Got tons of nighttime photos. Overall, great experience. We finally left, and or passed by what seemed like a dozen cars on the way back to ours. Seemed like we had entered back into civilization after our adventure.
Weird.
Mm-hmm. Fast forward the next day, going through pictures, I find one that looks like a subtle outline of a woman holding what appears to be a baby. Pretty psyched by this. It's not a clear, oh, that's a ghost type of picture. Just a blur of white that roughly resembles the silhouette of a woman holding a baby, which I thought was kind of cool looking.
Yeah.
Showed it to my friends, who in turn showed me their pictures, one of which is the headstone that has nothing on it except the words infant daughter. Toys are scattered.
Scattered.
Wittily.
Wittily
They
scattered.
scattered everywhere.
Toys are scattered all over the headstone and on the ground from various visitors to the cemetery. We look it up, and it turns out that a woman apparition has been dubbed the Madonna is a common story among other people visiting the cemetery. They say it's a woman in white that appears while holding an infant or baby. Super spooked. Awesome. Fast forward again, roughly 6 years. The pictures taken were misplaced, and I have nothing to show for the visit. But me and my friends fondly talk about that night when chatting about anything spooky that... when chatting and anything spooky comes up in conversation. My mother, who I told all of this to right after it happened, bought a haunted Chicago book.
Ooh.
This is still about 6 years later on a typical day, with a list of multiple haunted places in the city and what supposedly happens in these places. She's looking through the book while I'm watching TV, and all I hear is, "Holy shit!" from her. I look up, and she's staring at me with the most shocked but excited face ever. I bite and ask, "What'd you find?" She reads a portion about Bachelor's Grove Cemetery that describes one of the things that people say happened there, which is a farmhouse that appears for some with a glowing light emanating from it. Evidently, the location varies, and sometimes it even moves farther from people as they approach it, and it ultimately vanishes upon exiting the cemetery. Some say if you enter, you never come out. You know, typical spooky story stuff.
Mm.
But my mom was freaking out because she remembered me mentioning that I had gone up to a house with a light and casually left as to not get caught on the property. This isn't a house that's there that people just tell spooky stories about. Another tidbit about it is that there's no record of any houses being anywhere on the cemetery grounds or even near it. I've been back once during the day, and there was no 5-foot path into the woods, no house anywhere around the cemetery. I thought the picture I got was pretty cool. Finding out that a house I saw and talked about casually over the course of the next 6 years to various people turned out to not actually exist, that gave me chills.
That's nuts.
Right. I
That's
love that it's like,
crazy.
this person saw probably both of the two, like, big ghosts. The
Yeah.
house and the Madonna. So the infant daughter grave, the stone is actually allegedly not in the right spot. So the reason that I forgot to talk about this. The reason that the ghost is called Mrs. Rogers is because the infant daughter tombstone is adjacent to a woman's tombstone whose name is Mrs. Rogers.
I see.
And they're like, oh, the infant daughter is her kid. It's actually the infant daughter tombstone is a replacement tombstone for a tombstone that was stolen, destroyed, whatever. And it was supposed to be placed like over here. And they
Oh.
put it in the wrong spot.
Got it.
There is no like record of an infant daughter being
To
born
Mrs. Rogers.
to Mrs. Rogers that would have been buried with her. There's not a child's cemetery there. Or
Got it.
child's burial there.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a couple more Reddit stories, but I'm going to skip them because that second one is the best one. Now, TripAdvisor reviews. I have 3 TripAdvisor reviews for you of the cemetery, which is the funniest thing I've ever gotten to include in an episode. Terry from Chicago writes, I have gone with kids and with friends. Each time, something strange has happened. One time, a deer was unaware we were there. It was eating along the outside fence of the cemetery. When it came to the gate, it stopped and stared into the cemetery for almost 5 minutes, just staring. It decided to not go in and walked away. Oh my gosh, it gave us all goosebumps. I'd been there a handful of times over 20 years. 5 stars.
Good
Good
review.
job, Terry.
Now we have Lawrence from Arizona. So Terry's a local. She's from Chicago. Lawrence from Arizona. I have heard stories of the existence of ghostly haunts and apparitions in Bachelor's Grove and had to check it out for myself. It is hidden down a winding path which is marked as being closed. You definitely have to search for it. While originally able to handle 40-plus internments, only 21 markers are visible today. Time and vandals have taken their toll on this cemetery. Because of the remote location, it lends itself towards the mysterious. After a quiet hour, I turned to leave, only to find a man standing directly behind me. He said nothing and moved away. I assumed he was there to check things out, as there's no caretaker for the cemetery. Gave me quite a start. 5 stars.
5 stars. I'd be like, fuck that.
Yeah.
I saw maybe the scariest thing I've ever seen in my goddamn life.
5 stars.
5 stars.
Now we have Vlad Superman 2 of Ohio.
Oh, sick.
Yeah.
What a name.
Yeah. I'm also going to read this exactly as written.
Okay.
We stopped here and followed trail back to the cemetery, and I was disappointed. It was so small, the main sign was gone, only about 20 headstones left, most broke or knocked down. I can say I was there, but I won't go back and tell others to lower expectations.
Oh.
1 star.
Oh.
These are so funny.
That's such a good idea.
Gave me quite a start. 5 stars.
5 stars.
Lower your expectations. 1 star.
Tell others to lower. I will say he did not say expectations. He said expectations.
Expectations.
1 star.
Lower expectations.
Lower expectations. 1 star. So, what'd you learn?
I learned a ton. I don't think I knew any of the history. We talked about this in Hauntings. Paranormal TV shows don't have time to go in depth.
Right. They don't have time to do the history.
You got maybe 40 to 45 minutes of syndicated television time. Good luck.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like usually an 8 to 12 hours, sometimes even more investigation.
Yeah.
Your history is going to be like 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love the history, obviously.
Yeah.
I think the haunts here feel very different than a lot of other haunted locations we talk about.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially cemeteries.
Especially a generalized cemetery haunting. This is a very odd one.
Right. It's because it's in the woods.
I think it's because
Maybe.
I think there's some level, personally, of
Right.
fae activity happening.
Right.
The lights seem UFO to start with. I don't think that's what that is.
Right.
Especially because of the house phenomena.
Yeah.
House is so weird.
That is very odd because there's nothing that would give it a ghost story aspect.
Right.
Like, there's no-
other than the alleged like caretaker's house getting burned down, but like the whole caretaker story feels
It feels
made
like
up.
they made it
Yeah.
up to make, like other folklore, they made that up to make that phenomena make sense.
Yeah.
Right. Or they were like, oh, we see this guy who chases us out. He has a light. We also see this house. Maybe
It
they're
has a
connected.
light.
Yeah.
But the disappearing, shrinking house
The
feels
shrinking is crazy.
very fey, especially if the lore is if you get into the house,
You're gone.
You don't
you're gone,
come back. Yeah.
which feels very fey circle, like you're being
Yeah.
sucked through the veil somehow.
Right.
So I thought that was really neat. Obviously, it's well known because it's got what is or is not a ghost photograph.
Right.
Like,
it's either a
it
person
is-
or it's a ghost.
like that's. I would say it's controversial because it has to be one or the other.
Right. It's either a person or it's a ghost.
Yeah.
Those are your choices.
Because I mean, I trust Carl Pfeiffer pretty implicitly when it comes to camera stuff, but if it were
That man knows cameras.
Right, which is why they asked him.
Exactly.
They were like, hey, you know cameras. What can you tell from this picture?
But in general, if it were some kind of trick photography, it would have been debunked by this point.
right.
Yeah.
Like, that picture has existed for so long.
It's existed for longer than I've been alive. It was taken in 1991.
So
It looks way older than that. So a lot of people are like, oh, this picture's so old. It's black and white because it's IR, not because it was taken with an old-ass camera.
So I loved that. I think it's a really interesting both history and haunting concept because it doesn't feel like your standard cemetery haunt.
Yeah.
Right.
It feels odd. Like it feels
Kind of yucky, but not yucky at the same time.
it feels to me like almost like otherworldly. Like
Right.
it has this element of like there's something weird happening.
Right.
Like
To me, it feels like, just to interrupt and probably
Yeah.
maybe help you a little bit, it feels like this stuff has probably been happening in those woods long before there was a cemetery there.
Yeah.
And then we put a cemetery there, and people go to a cemetery to try and find ghosts, and
Yeah.
they're experiencing phenomena that has been happening in those woods long before the 1820s when people moved to the area.
right.
Like, there's something in, like, that.
There's just something
Those
inherent
woods-
to that part of the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I agree.
and I think also, like, I think
Like, I would like to go into the woods across the road,
Yeah.
the Rubio Woods, and see if there's anything weird over there.
Yeah.
I also think that like whatever phenomena may have been happening there for a long time was probably exacerbated by the energy of people being buried there.
By the energy of people being buried there, by the hooligan activities of the teens.
Yep.
All that stuff. And like the house being a fairy circle, being a fae circle, it's an updating of a phenomena.
Yeah.
Right? We talk about that all the time of like,
Yeah.
is this concept the updating of an older phenomena?
Yeah. Is
Are-
this the same thing in a
Are
new skin?
UFOs and aliens just fae? Like, it's the updating of a phenomena.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very ooky spooky, very weird.
Love it.
I think that's everything we need to know. Oh, do you have something?
I'd like to visit.
I would
would
love
like
to
to
go
visit.
there.
Yeah.
I would like to go there. I would like to go. There's a ton of spooky stuff in Chicago.
Yeah.
I've been to Chicago twice and did not know about this place.
I've never been to Chicago.
I have been to Chicago once.
Anyway, I think that's everything we need to know about Bachelor's Grove for now until we go there ourselves.
Yep.
Tune in next week to hear something spooky and ooky about
spooky.
maybe another haunted location.
I don't know. Maybe.
Wink.
Thanks for listening.
This podcast is for weirdos.
Are you a weirdo?
Thursdays are for the phenomena.